Hi, welcome to HowtoDandD. My name is Fred Wheeler and today I want to talk about Dungeons and Dragons. And today's topic is advanced passive perception applications in your Dungeons and Dragons 5e game. I want to make it clear for those of you who haven't already watched my video on passive perception, that would be quite useful. I would suggest going and checking that out right now, or you can do that later on if you want to, that's fine. But you have to understand that this video is not going into the basic mechanics of passive perception. I've already done that. I'm not doing that again. I also have a video called Perception Checks. So if you're not familiar with perception checks and passive perception, those would be two good videos to go and check out before watching this, or watching those as well, just so you're up to speed. Now, the intention for this video is to cover advanced applications, as I said, and one of the issues you'll find with advanced applications of passive perception is you can open up your Dungeon Master's Guide, you could open up your Player's Handbook, but you would expect there would be something in the Dungeon Master's Guide to help you figure out what was going on. To be fair though, I don't think that Dungeons and Dragons 5e was play tested long enough to be able to figure out some of the issues that would pop up. But passive perception was used in the past in Dungeons and Dragons 4e. So some of the issues should have been prevalent and the designers should have been aware of those issues. Whether they thought they were an issue or not, that might have been the issue for them, that there wasn't an issue to be created from using passive perception. Now, I still think that there are some benefits to using passive perception. Its intention is to make gameplay faster. Its intention is also to try to reduce the amount of metagaming by players when they are normally rolling checks. So you eliminate the dice roll to hopefully circumvent that passive, can we call it passive metagaming? Maybe we can call it passive metagaming. But essentially, the most important skill in Dungeons and Dragons is perception. It is the most often used. It is the one that will get you out of trouble. It is the one that allows you to really detect all the different things going on in your world. So it's a no-brainer that most players, if they are power gamers or even if they are experienced players, are quite likely to take passive perception as a trained skill or as a proficient skill simply because of that fact. And I don't have so much an issue with that, but it does present a whole lot of problems for you when we start bringing in things like passive perception. When you have the random variation of a dice roll where you can roll a 20-sided dice and get a result which is a 1 or a 20, there's a huge amount of variation. So there's a lot of possibility for options and possibilities for a dungeon master to have traps activate and ambush monsters be able to be effective and stuff like that. But we don't need to get into that just yet. So the concept is the passive perception is a static score. So there's no variation you need to worry about when you're rolling a dice. Whereas there's quite a lot of variation involved with rolling a dice. That is it's probably where the future of Dungeons and Dragons is going, is the passive check, where there's no dice rolling taking place at all. I don't know how long it would take for the game system to go that way, but I feel like it is starting to move in that direction. Now, I know people are going to say, well, but Fred, if you look at the average, passive perception is just your perception modifier and you add 10. And if you think about when you're rolling a 20-sided dice, the average result on that is probably going to be just over 10. What it doesn't take into place, and bear in mind my degree is in psychology and maths, so I do understand a little bit about maths, you still have variation, whereas you remove that variation when you're using a passive perception check. And that's what is actually important to understand, not the average. The average is actually not a very good indicator for many things. When you think about averages and how effective they are in measuring something, they are a tool that can be used in a certain way, but not always effective. Which means this makes passive perception a very, very important skill, and not only that, a very important mechanic. Ultimately, for the players, and probably less for the Dungeon Master. Now, I know that sounds strange, but bear with me and I will explain. This means that players are probably going to prefer a Dungeon Master who is using passive perception, because the chance of failure with regard to difficulty class has been reduced. Now, I have found that myself, that there have been players who are like, you don't use passive perception for this check, and in some cases they would expect passive perception to be used at every occasion and no dice rolling taking place whatsoever. And what they've done is they've built their character so that their static passive perception is extremely high, and therefore rolling a dice is actually bringing in a whole lot of variation they don't want, because they have been able to eliminate that variation. Therefore, the chance of failure is actually minimal. And I know this to be a fact. It's happened to me many, many times. I've had people show up at my table with very high passive perceptions, even at low levels. You are never going to get less than 10 with your passive perception, unless whoever built the character and has a character built with wisdom as a dump stat, which I think is a bit odd. Certainly there are ability scores that you can sort of, dump and not worry too much about having at least a 10 in them, but wisdom wouldn't really be one that I would consider. Considering how much you use wisdom and how much you're using perception, it would be, I think, folly. So even if you had a negative modifier, you're still looking at a 9. You're not going to get less than a 9, but 10 is still quite high. And bear in mind that if you were adding your perception modifier, like I said, and you rolled low, like a 1 or a 2, you're going to be getting quite a lot less than 10. So there is a huge benefit in having passive perception as a skill and a mechanic in the game for players. If players are using passive perception and the Dungeon Master is also allowing, in certain circumstances, an active roll where they actually get to roll a 20-sided dice, the players are going to do very well. They will notice dangers and details more often. Their chances of failure have been reduced. Now, I know a lot of people say, well, this is only an issue if you look at it in the perspective of player versus Dungeon Master and it being competitive, and Dungeons and Dragons is a cooperative game, it's not a competitive game. So why would this be an issue? Why would this be a factor to consider? I want you to think about it, because some of the things I'm about to say further on will play into what I've just said. So remember, players using a passive perception and getting the option to use an active check, which I do in my game quite a lot, and I'm sure other Dungeon Masters do as well, depending on what the players are going to say or have their character do. They are going to do those sorts of things. This increases again the chance of success and reduces the chance of failure. Now, for those of you who are using feats, the observant feat can push a level 1 character to a passive perception of 20, making it pretty much impossible to not detect all traps, all secret doors, pretty much all hazards, and all ambush monsters. That's what we're dealing with. The chance and likelihood when you have a passive perception at level 1 that you will fail, and it's happened to me on many occasions, and I'll explain to you how you can do that. Observant gives you +5 when you are using the observant feat and you're using your passive perception. So you get +5. Then what you're going to do is you're going to trick out your wisdom modifier. So often this will be the case with a cleric who has, say, a 16 at level 1, their modifier is a +3, they are proficient, so they add their proficiency modifier, which is a +2. 3 plus 2 plus the 5 from observant, they get a 10, then they add on, because it's a passive check, another 10, suddenly they have a passive perception of 20. You think about most of the difficulty classes that you're dealing with as a Dungeon Master, and how many of those are higher than 20? When you look at pre-published adventures, most of those checks are less than 20. In fact, even in some cases, actually in many cases, for traps, secret doors, and other hazards. And as we get up in the levels, so once we start getting up into level 5, 10, 15, 20 with characters, we can see some pretty outrageous passive perception scores. And there's no variation. It's essentially an automatic success. So it is possible essentially to never fail those sorts of things, given and provided you haven't adjusted DCs for pre-published adventures. And here's your problem. It starts walking into the realm of a Dungeon Master having to make adjustments to something that really wasn't intended to be adjusted. Players will trick out passive perception. I have already talked briefly about how you can do it, but they will do this. And there are other ways of tricking out passive perception with some of the races, class features that you can pick up, even with a spell. There's spells that will allow you to do this as well. I don't want to go into a lot of detail, but bearing in mind, if you've got players at your table who aren't going to utilize passive perception and exploit it in a significant way, they're still getting 10. So they're not going to get less than a 10. And for those players who are experienced and probably know how to work the system, there's a good chance they will trick out their passive perception, or at least their perception score. Because there's ways of picking up proficiency with perception with just your background. Okay, so now we've got the power games are definitely going to do it. I think you'll find that most power gamers know that being surprised and having a good perception score or passive perception is really important. That would be the thing that I would encounter the most at my table. It's happened to me. I know that's what takes place. I've talked to many players who are power gamers who play at my table, and that is exactly their intention. Okay, so once you introduce the concept of passive perception, a dungeon master might want to pretty much remove this mechanic. But you're now screwed as a dungeon master, because once you actually present the concept of this mechanic to players and they know about it, and then you say, I don't like the passive perception mechanic, I want to remove it, or I want to change how it's applied, chances are you're going to have a whole lot of players who get frustrated and angry with you. And I mean, it's like you're taking a toy away from them. So therefore you have a whole lot of other baggage to deal with as you contend with having to explain to players why you don't want to do it this way, because it just means you have to adjust everything else so that at least something is a surprise to them. Otherwise, nothing will be undiscovered. I mean, as a general rule, dungeon masters don't want secret doors to not be found. Secret doors are good to be found. In some cases, we might want about 50% to be found. Traps, dungeon masters don't really want 50% of traps to be found. They would like less than 50% of traps to be found so that they actually get a chance to do something. Otherwise, they never come into play. When it comes to monsters and ambushes are often a fairly significant aspect to Dungeons & Dragons. And this is because the number of rounds in your game for Dungeons & Dragons 5e is so short. There's not really that many rounds before combat's finished. 1 or 3 rounds and it's all over, and we're going to go and do something else. So it actually makes it very, very difficult when you decide as a dungeon master you don't want to use passive perception as it is played out or explained in the player's handbook, or that you want to make adjustments to it. And I can tell you from experience, I have found that very much the case, and I did not make massive adjustments and changes to passive perception. My application and how I applied passive perception and when I applied passive perception changed. But when somebody has the observant feat and they've tricked out passive perception, they really do not want to roll dice because it's not to their advantage to do so. So, just something to bear in mind. Okay, now we're starting to get into the crunchy bits and pieces. Now, when players are aware of how useful the mechanic is, as I've said, and when you remove it, they're likely to be annoyed. And I don't mean, I've had players who have been furious with me and refused to continue playing when I have not used a passive perception check rather than, and I've called for an active dice roll. They've been utterly furious. And it's because they have invested in their character build, the observant feat, or they have invested points into pimping out their perception modifier, or they have invested a background, or they have selected perception as a trained skill, and therefore they feel like they're being robbed. So this really makes the whole concept of using passive perception and active rolls vastly more complicated than it was before. Okay, so players like to roll dice, and this passive perception eliminates that process. I have found players who despise passive perception. They don't care about the mechanical aspect of it. What they care about is the fact that they get to roll dice. They're really, a lot of players who play Dungeons and Dragons are very much tied into the gambling mentality, and dice rolling is the gambling mentality. They are quite prepared to roll dice for absolutely everything. So there'll be times when you're using passive perception and players won't like that because they don't get to roll dice. Now, one of the big factors with passive perception, one of the big draws that the designers talked about and why we use it, is players metagaming their dice rolls. This was one of the big factors that was discussed about why we have passive perception, why we have that passive perception score. But the problem is that players were metagaming when they were rolling dice for perception checks. Now they're metagaming for passive perception. If they know that their score is low for passive perception, and they know that the Dungeon Master is using passive perception, they know that most of the time they will not spot stuff. If their passive perception is like a 10 or 11, they know that usually they're not going to pick it up. And so they'll always be looking to somebody who has a better passive perception than they have. So don't think that using passive perception will eliminate metagaming by players. It is just a different type of metagaming that's taking place as they try to figure out how to get around and work with this new mechanic that's been applied, which has been here since Dungeons and Dragons 4e. Okay, so there are a few things when you're using passive perception that Dungeon Masters tend to forget. I forget them all the time. But Dungeon Masters forget that light sources and the party's movement speed will affect passive perception. So if you're moving at normal speed and you're not moving at half speed, then you should be applying disadvantage to your passive perception. If your light source, you don't have a light source and you're dealing with dim light, then you should be applying disadvantage with your light source, depending on the type of vision that you have. If you have normal vision and you have a light source, anything in the realm of dim light, you have disadvantage. And this brings us to the often called upon mechanic for players, because just about every single race has it, right? There isn't really a race. There's only a couple of races that don't have dark vision. And this is forgotten by players, sometimes accidentally, sometimes deliberately, but more often it is forgotten by Dungeon Masters as well. Because even though you have dark vision, if you are in a dark environment, you are supposed to still apply disadvantage when you're making your check. That applies to passive perception as well, not just an active check, but passive perception. That means whatever your passive perception was, it's now less by 5 because you're applying disadvantage. A static score when you're applying disadvantage is -5. If you're applying advantage, it's a +5. And this particular mechanic is quite often forgotten completely. So there's a lot of things that normally players would never have noticed, but because of players forgetting or ignoring it, or Dungeon Masters forgetting it, it's another level of complications with regard to vision that comes into play. And when I talk about perception and passive perception being one of the hardest aspects of the game to deal with, I'm really quite serious, because there's so many things to remember at the same time. You're dealing with the environment, you're dealing with light, you're dealing with whether you're applying advantage or disadvantage, you're dealing with the different types of vision that players have. And it's very easy to completely forget that this applies. And this actually changes how powerful passive perception is. Okay, what happens if you do the most unthinkable thing? You remove, or because feats are a variant role. If you remove feats from the game, or it's a variant role and you decide, well, you know, I'm not going to use that. That means that the observant feat is no longer in play. This will certainly reduce the abuse on passive perception. But what is the result? Absolutely, players are going to fail more perception checks because their passive perception because they can't utilise that observant feat now, is going to be a lot less. Certainly agree that that will do that. But the fallout for a Dungeon Master in terms of the player's reaction to that, I can tell you I have had some really twisty, curly problems with players when we've even talked about the idea of just not using feats, or what if we just didn't use the observant feat. Now, I didn't actually bring up that topic. Other players at my table had brought up the topic when I've talked about passive perception and perception checks, and other players who've heard this have been ropeable, just lost it. So what do we do? Okay, so what are some ways we can try and fix that? Setting a higher DC for passive perception and perception checks, that will certainly counter a lot of the feats, like the observant feat, taking it as a trained skill. But now you're really, as a Dungeon Master, I feel like you're now metagaming yourself to try to make things play out the way that you want them to. And setting higher DCs for passive perception will certainly counter some of the problems with a group check. So when you have a passive perception check required, or a perception check required for the entire group, obviously a group check, the likelihood of success, somebody's going to probably notice the danger or the trap or the secret door or the ambush or whatever it is. And so that is certainly going to be increasing the likelihood of success for the party. And that means that by lifting the DC higher, they're going to trigger those threats more often. So that's certainly one way of doing it, but it's not. But it's not as easy as it sounds, because there's other things, there's other parts to the whole mechanic that are fallout, and it's usually a response from the players. That's what I have found myself. Okay, so 3 more things. Group checks, as I said, definitely significantly increase the benefits to the players' characters, which is why most groups and players will like the idea of a group check for perception. The vast majority of perception checks are in fact a complete waste of time, which means that passive perception becomes a complete waste of time. Now, I'll tell you why the vast majority of passive perception checks are a waste of time. That is because, as I was talking about, the likelihood of a passive perception, even if you don't use the observant feat, there's likely to be somebody in the party, and I'm talking about you, clerics, and those of you who are druids. You're going to have probably a passive perception of 15. That makes any DC required for a perception check of 15 or less easily achievable. It can be done with no real significant worry. There's no dice rolling, there's no risk. Now, there are some factors that come into passive perception and perception checks, whether you are distracted or maybe if you're not in the front of the party, things like that. But players will work around that. They'll figure out that the most perceptive person should be at the front so that they can actually detect the threats, because usually the threats are in the front rather than in the back of the party. Now, I know some people are saying, no, it's nowhere near as high as a DC 15. But here's the thing. Even if we talk about a DC 10, you think about the DCs in the pre-published adventures. They're almost a waste of time even printing those DCs of 10 or 11 or 12, because somebody is going to have a passive perception of about that, and they will pick it up. They'll pick up that threat. So it's almost a no-brainer to sort of look at those and just put a line through them. You've just wasted your time, which means if you're creating your own adventures, creating a DC of 10, 11, or even 12, if we're being really sort of pedantic about the whole passive perception and check process, those are all a waste of time. You wouldn't even bother. You shouldn't really even bother having those sort of checks there. Now, I know a lot of people say, yeah, but you have to lift and move things around to actually check an environment. What players do when they are dealing with their environment and playing their Dungeons & Dragons games is they say, I check the whole passageway for secret doors and traps and da-da-da-da. They cover their bases. They run through their perception macro. The same thing for a room. The same thing for a door. You know, they won't say, I'm not going to. They won't specify that they're lifting up the treasure chest lid, or they're removing the treasure chest or moving the furniture, they'll say, I'm just going to check the whole room thoroughly. Now you might say as a dungeon master, that's not good enough, you need to give me more detail. They'll give you more detail, but you still run into the problem of headbutting yourself against players who are saying, well, you're just being a dick, you're just being difficult. So this is my sort of rundown of what happens with passive perception and the perception check. And honestly, it's one of the most complicated and difficult mechanics to get your head around without it all unraveling on you and causing you quite a lot of strife, in my opinion. Now, if you found this video helpful, informative and useful, fantastic. I have hundreds of videos for players and dungeon masters, which you're welcome to check out. As I said, I have a video on passive perception and on perception checks and on passive checks, and you might find those useful as well. Now, if you want to support the channel so I keep doing this, I have a Patreon page where all of the unlisted live streams go, additional content and priority on the video content that I make. I have an affiliate link to the book depository on Amazon that also helps support the channel, and I have a merchandise shelf. Make sure to share, like and subscribe, hit the bell button to be notified when I go live and when I publish new videos, and hey, till next time, keep rolling those 20s.